How do you measure power? In dollars? In bars of gold? Forget that. Try these numbers: 200 years, 5 nations, one global financial system. That was the Warburgs' power on paper. But here are the numbers written in flesh and blood. Millions of dollars stolen, thousands of families shattered, and 6 million souls as the ultimate price. This is the story of the Warburgs, where the ledgers don't track profits. They track the price of survival. The Warburgs' power wasn't born of ambition. It was squeezed out of 400 years of being backed into a corner. It began in the 16th century Venice, the commercial center of the world. Here, Jewish merchants, master financiers, were forced into a walled-off section of the city, the world's first ghetto. Barred from owning land and most trades, they were left with only one path: finance. Physically imprisoned, their minds were sharpened. The ghetto was a prison, but it was also an incubator. When Venice faded, the family moved north to Germany, settling in the town of Warburg, and the name stuck. Life here was even harder. They weren't citizens, but Schutzjuden, protected Jews, which really meant they were the personal property of local lords, paying absurd taxes just to exist. Once again, they were pushed into small-time lending, building a reputation on absolute integrity, one deal at a time. Finally, in the 18th century, they reached Hamburg. This was a different universe. Hamburg wasn't run by a prince, but by merchants. The city didn't care about your creed. It cared about the profit you could generate. For a family with generations of honed financial skill, this was the promised land. In 1798, amidst the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, brothers Moses and Gerson Warburg founded the bank M.M. Warburg and Company. While empires fell, they thrived, financing governments, ensuring risky shipments, and mastering currency swings. When the Industrial Revolution ignited the 19th century, M.M. Warburgs and Company became Germany's financial engine. They didn't just lend money, they built a nation. They financed the railroads that stitched the country together, the steel mills that armed its armies, and the shipping lines that projected German power across the globe. By the time the German Empire was unified in 1871, the Warburgs were at the pinnacle. They were advisors to the Kaiser, great philanthropists, and the embodiment of the German elite. They saw themselves as Germans of the Jewish faith, fiercely patriotic. They had reached heights their ancestors in the Venetian ghetto could never have dreamed of. Into this world of immense wealth, power, and profound patriotism, a pivotal generation was born. Moritz Warburg and his wife Charlotte Oppenheim raised 5 brilliant sons, each destined to steer the family's legacy through the most devastating storms of the 20th century. The eldest was Aby, born in 1866. From a very early age, it was clear that Aby was cut from a different cloth. He was intense, scholarly, eccentric, and utterly captivated by the world of books and art. The sober, rational world of finance held no interest for him. He found it soul-crushingly dull. He was fascinated by the deep, often irrational currents of human psychology as expressed through symbols, myths, and art, particularly that of the Italian Renaissance. Next came Max, born just a year after Aby in 1867. If Aby was the dreamer, Max was the doer. He was pragmatic, disciplined, and possessed a natural and prodigious talent for banking and diplomacy. He understood power, he understood people, and he understood money. He was the quintessential statesman banker, groomed from an early age to inherit the leadership of the family's empire. Then came Paul, born in 1868. Paul was the intellectual, the deep thinker, the analyst. He shared Max's interest in finance, but his passion was more theoretical. He wasn't just interested in making deals. He was fascinated by the underlying systems and structures of the financial world. He was a keen observer of the differences between the banking systems in Germany, England, and America, constantly analyzing their strengths and weaknesses. He was a financial architect in the making. Felix, born in 1871, was different again. He was the charmer, the socialite, the bon vivant. Endowed with immense warmth and personal magnetism, Felix had a gift for connecting with people. While he was a capable banker, his true passions lay elsewhere, in art, in his family, and above all, in helping others. His talents were perfectly suited for the world of relationships, a gift that would make him not only a legendary networker on Wall Street, but one of the great philanthropists of his age. Finally, there was Fritz, the youngest, born in 1879, often overlooked in popular histories that focus on his more famous older brothers. Fritz was the steadfast anchor. He too would dedicate his life to the family bank in Hamburg, working quietly and diligently in the shadow of his powerhouse brother, Max, providing a crucial element of stability and continuity. These 5 brothers were raised with a rigorous education, steeped in the classics, fluent in several languages, and sent abroad to train in the great financial capitals of London, Paris, and New York. They inherited not just a vast fortune, but the immense weight of a legacy built over centuries. Their paths would soon diverge, stretching from the great libraries of Europe to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., but they remained bound together by blood, by ambition, and by a shared destiny that would be tested by the most cataclysmic events of the modern era. The stage was set. The 20th century was about to begin. The dawn of the 20th century was an age of supreme confidence, of boundless optimism in the power of technology, reason, and progress. It was also an age of deep and unsettling anxieties, roiling just beneath the glittering surface of La Belle Époque. For the 5 sons of Moritz and Charlotte Warburg, this complex world was not an abstract concept. It was the landscape upon which they would build their lives. Raised in a home that was a nexus of global finance and high culture, they were uniquely equipped to navigate this era. But they would do so on their own terms, their individual personalities and passions pulling them in profoundly different directions, stretching the family's influence and identity across continents and across the very different worlds of art, banking, and public policy. Their story is the story of a dynasty at its absolute zenith, unknowingly standing on the precipice of a century that would both elevate them to unprecedented heights and threaten them with utter annihilation. The destiny of the Warburg family in this new century was shaped by this remarkable generation of brothers, but the first to defy that destiny was the eldest, Aby. Born in 1866, Aby Warburg was a man haunted by genius. From his earliest days, it was clear that the meticulously ordered world of finance, the lifeblood of his family, held no appeal for him. He found its logic stifling, its materialism empty. His passion was for the past, not for its neat chronologies and famous kings, but for its hidden, irrational, and often terrifying psychological undercurrents. He was drawn to the swirling, turbulent world of art, myth, and culture of the Florentine Renaissance, seeing it not as a calm rebirth of classical reason, but as a dramatic battleground where the passionate pagan spirit of antiquity clashed with the restraining forces of Christian morality and rationalism. This rejection of the family business was formalized in a now legendary pact. As the eldest son, tradition dictated that he would inherit the leadership of M.M. Warburg and Company. In a moment of extraordinary foresight, the young Aby made his younger brother Max, then just 13 years old, a stunning proposition. Aby would formally renounce his birthright, ceding his place at the head of the bank to Max. His price? A simple yet fantastically extravagant promise that Max would be obligated to buy him any book he ever wanted for the rest of his life. Max, already possessing the instincts of a shrewd banker, immediately recognized a good deal and agreed. It was a bargain he would honor, without question, for the next 4 decades, unknowingly financing the creation of one of the most unique and important private libraries in the world, an institution that would become Abe's life's work and his enduring monument. Abe became an art historian, but that label is a woefully inadequate description of his work. He was a cultural theorist, a student of human psychology, an intellectual adventurer who shattered the traditional boundaries between academic disciplines. He wasn't interested in simply cataloging paintings by date and artist, the great man approach to art history. He wanted to understand what he called the Nachleben der Antike, the afterlife of antiquity. He was obsessed with how the symbols, gestures, and emotionally charged images of the ancient pagan world survived the centuries, migrating across cultures and re-emerging often unconsciously in the art of the Renaissance and beyond. He called these recurring images pathos formon, or pathos formulas, visual expressions of extreme emotional states like grief, rage, or ecstasy. His research took him to the most unexpected places. In 1895, he took a bizarre detour from his Florentine studies and traveled to the American Southwest to live among the Pueblo and Hopi peoples. He wasn't a tourist. He was an anthropologist seeking to understand a culture without a Parthenon. He meticulously documented their rituals, most famously the harrowing snake dance of the Hopi, in which dancers held live rattlesnakes in their mouths. In the terrifying power of this ritual, he saw a direct connection to the pagan serpent cults of ancient Greece. He believed he was witnessing a primal pre-rational state of human consciousness, a world where symbol and reality were one, a world that the Florentine Renaissance artists were both drawn to and terrified by. He was trying to create a psychology of human expression, a vast overarching theory that connected the most sophisticated art with the most primitive rituals. His personal life, however, was one of profound and agonizing struggle. He suffered from severe mental illness, likely bipolar disorder exacerbated by the trauma of World War I. He spent years, from 1918 to 1924, confined to the Bellevue Sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, under the care of the renowned psychiatrist Ludwig Binswanger. It was there, in a now famous lecture delivered to his fellow patients and doctors, in a desperate, heroic effort to prove his own sanity and secure his release, that he finally articulated his groundbreaking theories on the Hopi serpent ritual. He argued that the ritual was a way for the Hopi to confront their deepest fears, in this case, fear of lightning, which the snake symbolized, and master them through symbolic action. This, he argued, was the very root of culture, the creation of a space for thought, Dinkraum, between the self and the terrifying immediacy of reality. His magnum opus was his Mnemosyne Atlas, a sprawling, unfinished project consisting of large black panels on which he would arrange hundreds of photographs of artworks, newspaper clippings, and advertisements from different cultures and eras, trying to create a non-linear visual map of human memory and emotional history. Abe's story is a poignant and powerful reminder that the Warburg legacy is not just one of capital and influence, but of profound, radical, and often painful intellectual and cultural exploration. While Abe was exploring the labyrinth of the human mind, his brother Max stood firmly and brilliantly in the material world. Honoring his side of the childhood pact, Max took the reins of Warburg and Company at a young age, and through his sheer talent and relentless drive, steered the bank to its absolute peak of power and influence. If Abbey was the quintessential outsider, Max was the ultimate insider. He was everything his older brother was not: pragmatic, decisive, a master of detail, and a natural diplomat. He became one of the most powerful and respected men in Germany, a figure who moved with ease between the worlds of high finance and high politics. Max's influence extended far beyond Hamburg. He became a personal advisor to Kaiser Wilhelm II, a member of the so-called Kaiser's cabinet of trusted industrialists and bankers. This was a position of immense prestige, but also one of great delicacy. Max often had the difficult task of offering sober, realistic financial counsel to a monarch known for his bombastic rhetoric and erratic ambitions. He was instrumental in financing Germany's industrial might and its global expansion, particularly his friend Albert Berlin's Hamburg America line, which became a key instrument of German soft power around the world. Max's word carried enormous weight not just in the corporate boardrooms of Hamburg, but in the corridors of power in the capital, Berlin. He completely embodied the patriotic spirit of Germany's assimilated Jewish elite. He saw himself, without contradiction or apology, as a German first and foremost. He served on the supervisory boards of dozens of Germany's most important corporations. He negotiated sensitive international loans on behalf of the German government, his contacts in London, Paris, and New York making him an invaluable diplomatic asset. During the catastrophic First World War, he dedicated himself completely to the German war effort, placing the bank's resources and his own expertise at the service of the state to help manage the immense complexities of wartime finance. After Germany's devastating defeat, he was chosen as a key member of the German delegation to the Versailles Peace Conference. There, alongside the official diplomats, he fought passionately, using logical, fact-based arguments against the crushing and, in his view, economically illiterate reparations demanded by the victorious Allies. His warnings that the treaty would sow the seeds of future conflict were tragically prophetic. In the turbulent, chaotic years of the Weimar Republic that followed, he remained a powerful voice for reason, moderation, and stability, a staunch believer in Germany's democratic future. Max's life represented the absolute pinnacle of what German Jews had achieved and contributed. It was a story of profound integration, deep patriotism, and dedicated service, a reality that would make the subsequent betrayal by his beloved fatherland all the more tragic and incomprehensible. As Max was methodically consolidating his power in Germany, two of his younger brothers were looking west across the Atlantic with a different kind of ambition. Paul and Felix Warburg, brilliant and worldly in their own right, possessed a keen sense that the global center of gravity was beginning to shift. Europe, and specifically London, was still the undisputed center of the financial universe, but a new giant, a continental nation of unparalleled natural resources and explosive industrial energy, was awakening in America. In the 1890s, they made the fateful decision to emigrate, a move that would not only transform their own lives, but would fundamentally reshape the financial landscape of their new home and place the Warburg name at the heart of the American century. They arrived in a New York that was a city of stark and thrilling contradictions. It was the age of the robber barons, of staggering fortunes being made in railroads, steel and oil by men like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan. It was a city of magnificent Fifth Avenue mansions and squalid, overcrowded Lower East Side tenements. But for all its raw power and dynamism, its financial system was a dangerously unstable and primitive affair, a wild west of unregulated speculation compared to the established centralized banking systems of Europe that the Warburgs knew so well. Paul and Felix did not enter this world as poor, huddled masses. They came as princes of an established financial dynasty, carrying with them the most valuable assets of all, the Warburg name and the network of trust and credit it represented. They were immediately and warmly welcomed into the elite, close-knit circle of German Jewish banking families that had come to dominate Wall Street's investment banking sector. This group, later immortalized as our crowd, included families like the Loebs, the Schiffs, the Goldmans, the Saxes, and the Seligmans. They had created a powerful parallel financial establishment, bound by shared German origins, deep ties of intermarriage, and a common sense of being outsiders in the predominantly Anglo-Protestant old money world of commercial banking and corporate law. They had built their own ecosystem of trust in a world that was often suspicious of them, and the arrival of two sons of the great Warburg House of Hamburg was a major event. Paul Warburg, the deep thinker with a precise, almost academic mind, officially joined the prestigious investment bank of Kuhn, Loeb and Company in 1902. His entry was facilitated by his marriage years earlier, in 1895, to Nina Loeb, the thoughtful and intelligent daughter of one of the firm's founders, Solomon Loeb. Paul wasn't just joining a firm, he was being grafted onto a dynasty. At the time, the bank was under the absolute iron-fisted rule of its senior partner, Jacob Schiff. Schiff was a financial genius and a towering figure on Wall Street, a man who had orchestrated the financing for industrial titans like the Pennsylvania and Union Pacific Railroads. He was also a fierce and proud leader of the American Jewish community, famously using his financial power to punish Tsarist Russia for its brutal pogroms against Jews by helping to finance the Japanese military in the Russo-Japanese War. Schiff was not an easy man to impress, but he quickly recognized the extraordinary depth of Paul Warburg's intellect, Paul's profound first-hand knowledge of European banking practices, particularly the sophisticated discount markets and central banking systems of Germany and England, was an invaluable asset to a firm seeking to expand its international reach. Paul was not a natural deal-maker or a glad-handing salesman. He was a strategist, a theorist, a man who saw the underlying architecture of finance. He quickly became Schiff's most trusted intellectual partner. His younger brother Felix was a man of an entirely different temperament, and he followed a remarkably similar path. More outgoing, more charming, a man who radiated warmth and a genuine passion for life. Felix also joined Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He solidified his position in 1895, the same year as Paul's wedding, by marrying Frieda Schiff, Jacob's beloved and only daughter. This union made him not just a partner, but the son-in-law of the king. If Paul was the cool, analytical strategist, Felix was the master networker, the relationship builder. His charm opened doors, and his integrity built lasting trust. But his greatest passion, the driving force of his life, lay not in the accumulation of wealth, but in its strategic and compassionate distribution. Felix was destined to become one of the great philanthropists of his generation, a man whose generosity would build institutions that would change the face of American Jewish life and provide a lifeline to communities in crisis around the world. The double marriage of the two Warburg brothers to the daughters of the two senior partners of Wall Street's most powerful investment bank was more than just a coincidence or a matter of personal affection. It was a strategic alliance of the highest order, a classic move within our crowd to consolidate capital, talent, and influence. This merger of the Warburgs of Hamburg with the Schiffs and Loebs of New York created a transatlantic financial axis of immense power. The family now had a secure and powerful foothold in the two most important financial centers on Earth. The stage was set for them to play a truly global role. But it was Paul, the quiet intellectual, who was about to embark on a mission that he had been preparing for his entire life, a mission to tame the wild beast of American finance and secure his place in history. The American giant, which had beckoned Paul and Felix Warburg across the ocean, was a creature of immense power and dangerous instability. By the early 1900s, the United States had surpassed Great Britain to become the world's largest economy. Its factories churned out more steel, its oil fields produced more petroleum, and its railroads carried more freight than any other nation on Earth. It was a colossus, a dynamo of production and innovation. Yet this economic superpower was built upon a financial system that was, in Paul Warburg's own words, barbarous and antiquated. It was a system that lurched violently between periods of manic boom and devastating bust, a financial Wild West that threatened to bring the entire magnificent edifice crashing down. Paul Warburg, the quiet intellectual from Hamburg, had not come to America simply to make his fortune. He had come with a mission. He was a doctor who had arrived in a new land only to discover his patient was suffering from a chronic and potentially fatal disease. And he was convinced he was the only one who held the cure. Early 20th century America was an economic powerhouse, but its banking system was a dangerous relic, a legacy of the deep-seated populist distrust of centralized authority that stretched back to Andrew Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States in the 1830s. The country had over 20,000 individual banks, each a tiny kingdom unto itself, but there was no central institution to connect or support them. There was no lender of last resort, no institution that could provide emergency cash to a sound but temporarily besieged bank. Crucially, there was no elastic currency. The supply of money was fixed and rigid, based on the amount of government bonds banks held. It couldn't expand in the autumn when farmers needed credit to harvest their crops, nor could it expand in a crisis when frightened depositors all demanded their cash at once. The entire American financial system, as one critic described it, was a vast inverted pyramid, balanced precariously on the tiny apex of the gold reserves, held in the vaults of a few New York banks. It was inherently brittle, inflexible, and terrifyingly prone to panic. And in October of 1907, that panic erupted with a vengeance. The trigger was, as is so often the case, a bout of reckless speculation. A brazen attempt by a copper magnate named F. Augustus Heinze to corner the market on the stock of his own United Copper Company collapsed spectacularly. The failure took down the brokerage firm that backed it, which in turn triggered a run on the banks associated with Heinze and his associates. The first major domino to fall was the Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of New York's largest and most prestigious financial institutions. When the Knickerbocker, unable to meet the relentless flood of withdrawals, was forced to suspend payments on October 22, 1907, fear, a contagious and utterly irrational virus, spread through the city's financial district like wildfire. The logic of a bank run is both simple and terrifying. Depositors know their bank doesn't keep all of their money in cash in the vault. It has been loaned out to businesses and homeowners. They also know that if they get their money out first, they will be safe and those at the back of the line will be ruined. And so everyone rushes for the exit at once. Healthy banks were besieged alongside troubled ones. Credit, the essential lubricant of the entire economy, evaporated overnight. Businesses couldn't get loans to make payroll. Call money rates for stockbrokers soared to over 100%. The stock market went into freefall. plummeting by nearly 50% from its peak the previous year. The panic radiated out from New York across the country as provincial banks needing cash pulled their reserves out of the city, exacerbating the crisis. The nation, the richest and most productive on earth, was grinding to a halt, teetering on the brink of a complete and total economic collapse. In this moment of supreme crisis, the United States government was essentially powerless. There was no Federal Reserve, no Treasury mechanism to inject liquidity into the system. The fate of the entire American economy fell upon the shoulders of one private citizen, John Pierpont Morgan. The aging imperious titan of finance, the most powerful and feared man on Wall Street, was forced to act. At his own immense personal risk, he became the nation's de facto central bank. From his magnificent library, which became the command center for the rescue operation, Morgan summoned the presidents of New York's major banks and trust companies. According to legend, he locked the doors, pocketed the key, and refused to let anyone leave until they agreed to pool their resources and pledge their capital to prop up the failing institutions. He organized the financial community with the authority of a field marshal. He directed money to the stock exchange to prevent its collapse. He decided, with the force of a tribunal, which firms were salvageable and which must be allowed to fail. He even used the resources of the U.S. Steel Corporation, which he controlled, to shore up the system. It was a breathtaking display of private power. The crisis was eventually averted, but the lesson was seared into the minds of all who witnessed it. A modern industrial nation of 90 million people could not leave its financial fate in the hands of a single, aging, unelected plutocrat, no matter how brilliant or public-spirited. What would happen when he was gone? The system was fundamentally, catastrophically broken. America needed a better way. For one man, the panic of 1907 was not a surprise, but a grim, predictable, and infuriating confirmation of everything he had been arguing since he had arrived in America. Paul Warburg had watched the unfolding crisis with a sense of horrified vindication. Coming from Germany with its sophisticated centralized Reichsbank and having spent years training in London, the home of the mighty Bank of England, he was utterly appalled by the primitive chaos of the American system. To him, a great nation without a central bank was like a modern city without a central water supply or a fire department, a disaster just waiting to happen. As early as 1903, he had warned his father-in-law, Jacob Schiff, that the country's prosperity was illusory and that its disorganized banking system would inevitably lead to a great collapse. Now it had happened. Immediately, Paul Warburg transformed himself from a quiet partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company into a public crusader. He began a tireless campaign of education, writing articles for financial journals, giving speeches at chambers of commerce, and patiently explaining the intricacies of European central banking to a deeply skeptical American audience. He spoke of the desperate need for an elastic currency, one that could expand and contract to meet the legitimate needs of the economy, rather than being rigidly fixed. He explained, with the clarity of a born teacher, the concept of a discount market. This, he argued, was the key. In Europe, if a bank needed cash, it could take the short-term commercial loans it had made to reputable businesses, known as commercial paper, and sell them to the central bank at a small discount. This meant a well-run bank could always get cash, ensuring liquidity would never freeze up as it had in 1907. He argued for a central institution that would hold a portion of the nation's banking reserves, creating a great reservoir of capital that could be deployed to any part of the country in a time of crisis. His ideas were logical, proven, and technically brilliant, but they were also politically explosive. The very idea of a central bank was anathema to a huge portion of the American population. To Western populists and Southern agrarians, it was a tool of oppression, a scheme by the money trust of Wall Street and European bankers to control the nation's credit and exploit the common man. To many ordinary Americans, his ideas sounded suspiciously foreign, dangerously European. Paul Warburg was a man with the right diagnosis and the right cure, but he faced a monumental challenge in convincing the patient to take the profoundly unpopular medicine. By 1910, the political will for some kind of reform was growing. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, an immensely powerful Republican, a titan of the Senate, and the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., was tasked with heading a national monetary commission to study the problem and propose a solution. Aldrich, a quintessential New England conservative, was initially suspicious of Warburg's radical ideas. But after a 2-year tour of the European capitals, where he and his commission were tutored by the heads of the great central banks, he returned a convert. He was particularly impressed by the efficiency and stability of the German banking system. He now knew a central bank was the answer, but he also knew that any plan that was openly drafted by a group of Wall Street bankers, or that had his own deeply partisan name attached to it, would be dead on arrival in the populist anti-bank political climate. He needed a brilliant plan, and he needed absolute secrecy to create it. In November of 1910, a small and very select group of men received clandestine invitations. They represented, it was later estimated, roughly 1/6 of the total wealth of the entire world. They were instructed to travel with the utmost discretion to a train station in Hoboken, New Jersey, where a private, unmarked railway car would be waiting for them. To guard against discovery by reporters, they were told to come one at a time, to bring shotguns as if they were on a duck hunting trip, and to address one another only by their first names. The group included Senator Aldrich himself, Apiot Andrew, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, the powerful president of National City Bank of New York, the forerunner of Citibank, Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company, and the man who had been Morgan's chief lieutenant during the 1907 panic, Charles D. Norton, the president of the First National Bank of New York, and the intellectual architect of the entire gathering, Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Their destination was the Jekyll Island Club, a luxurious and utterly isolated winter retreat for America's wealthiest families, located off the coast of Georgia. For 10 days, these men, the absolute pinnacle of the American financial establishment, locked themselves away from the world. They debated, argued, and worked around the clock, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning, hammering out the framework for a new American banking system. It was Paul Warburg who dominated the intellectual proceedings. He patiently tutored the others on the complex principles of central banking, outlining the structure of the German Reichsbank and explaining how its mechanisms could be painstakingly adapted to the unique political and geographical realities of the vast United States. They wrestled for days with a central dilemma: how to create a system that was centralized enough to be effective in a crisis, yet decentralized enough to be politically palatable to a country so deeply suspicious of concentrated power in either Washington, D.C. or New York. Slowly, meticulously, a blueprint emerged. It was a plan for a National Reserve Association, a single central institution with 15 regional branches. It contained all the key ideas Warburg had been advocating for years. The men disbanded as secretly as they had gathered, sworn to absolute secrecy about their fateful meeting on the island. The secret of Jekyll Island would not be publicly revealed, by a participant for another 20 years, a fact that would later fuel decades of conspiracy theories. The road from the secret plan hatched on Jekyll Island to the statute books was long, winding, and fraught with political peril. The Aldrich Plan, as the proposal was initially known, was presented to Congress in 1912, and it was immediately attacked from all sides. Democrats and progressive Republicans denounced it as a transparent scheme by big bankers to create a central bank they would control for their own profit. The election of 1912, a three-way race between the Republican incumbent William Howard Taft, the progressive Theodore Roosevelt, and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson, completely upended the political landscape. Wilson's victory and the Democrats' seizure of control in Congress seemed to have doomed the plan for good. But President Wilson, a former history professor and the president of Princeton University, was an intellectual who understood the urgent need for banking reform. He was, however, also a canny politician who knew he had to address the widespread populist fears of a Wall Street-controlled central bank. He and his key congressional allies, notably the fiery Representative Carter Glass of Virginia and the progressive Senator Robert Owen of Oklahoma, took the core technical ideas of the Aldrich Plan, the ideas that had been meticulously crafted by Paul Warburg, and gave them a brilliant new political structure. They broke up the single central institution into 12 regional reserve banks, each one a separate corporation owned by the private member banks in its district. This created the appearance of decentralization that was so crucial for political acceptance. But, and this was the masterstroke, they placed a new Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. to oversee and coordinate the entire system. And the members of this powerful board would be public servants, appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It was a uniquely American hybrid, a masterful political compromise that balanced private participation with public oversight. After a fierce and exhausting legislative battle, the Federal Reserve Act was finally passed by Congress and signed into law by President Wilson on December the 23rd, 1913. It was arguably the most significant and far-reaching piece of domestic legislation in American history. When it came time to appoint the first members of the Federal Reserve Board who would build and run this new system, President Wilson knew he needed the one man who understood its intricate machinery better than anyone else on the planet. He nominated Paul Warburg to be one of its inaugural governors, but even this final step was not a simple matter. Paul's nomination set off a storm of controversy in the Senate. He was attacked relentlessly by a small group of senators for his deep ties to Wall Street and his partnership at Kuhn, Loeb, and Company, the very heart of the so-called money trust. But the attack soon took on a darker, more xenophobic tone. His German birth became an issue. In the increasingly nationalistic atmosphere of the pre-war years, some senators openly questioned his loyalty, labeling him a foreigner with foreign allegiances who represented the banking power of the old world. They argued that a man who had not been born in America was unfit to help manage the American economy. It was a deeply painful and humiliating public ordeal for a man who had dedicated nearly a decade of his life, his intellect, and his reputation to solving one of his adopted country's most pressing and dangerous problems. Paul had to endure grueling public hearings, patiently defending his integrity, his expertise, and his patriotism. He considered withdrawing his name several times, but in the end, his undeniable and unparalleled expertise won out. He was confirmed by the Senate in August 1914. As vice chairman of the new Federal Reserve Board, Paul Warburg, the immigrant from Hamburg, finally had the chance to put his vision into practice. His personal crusade was complete. The wild beast of American finance had at last been brought into a system of public accountability and control. While Paul Warburg was engaged in the high-stakes intellectual battle to fundamentally reshape the American financial system, his brother Felix was charting a different, though no less impactful course. If Paul's world was one of intricate policy, abstract theory, and public debate, Felix's was a world of immense warmth, personal connection, and transformative generosity. He was, by all accounts, a brilliant partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a respected financier whose judgment was highly valued. But the accumulation of wealth was not the driving passion of his life. For Felix, money was a tool, a means to an end, and that end was the Jewish principle of tzedakah, a word often translated simply as charity, but which, in its deep Hebrew roots, more accurately means justice, righteousness, and the sacred duty to create a more equitable world. Felix Warburg would become the very embodiment of this principle, a philanthropist on a scale that was, even in that gilded age of giving, simply breathtaking. Felix's home, Felix Hall, was a testament to his worldly success, but it was far more than a monument to wealth. It was a vibrant hub of cultural, intellectual, and charitable activity. With his wife Frida Schiff, he created a home that was both a sanctuary for their 5 children and a gathering place for some of the most interesting people of the age. Felix was a passionate and deeply knowledgeable art collector, amassing a collection that was considered one of the finest in private hands in America. It was filled with masterpieces by Cranach, Rembrandt, and Verrocchio, but unlike many collectors of his era who treated art as a private treasure to be hoarded, Felix saw it as a public trust, a vital part of our shared human heritage. He frequently opened his home to scholars, students, and museum groups. He saw no joy in possessing beauty if he could not share it with others. This philosophy would culminate in his family's decision after his death to donate their magnificent Fifth Avenue mansion to house the Jewish Museum, a gift that created a permanent home for the preservation and celebration of Jewish art and culture in the heart of New York City. He was a man who lived life on a grand scale, a lover of music, sport, and good company. But his greatest joy, the core of his identity, came from sharing his immense good fortune. He approached philanthropy not as a hobby, but as a profession, one that required the same strategic thinking, discipline, and attention to detail as his work at Kuhn, Loeb, and Company. He didn't just write checks, he built institutions. He didn't just alleviate suffering, he sought to create systems that would empower people and build resilient communities. The philanthropic vision of Felix Warburg was vast, but its heart was always with the Jewish community, both in his new American home and in the troubled old world they had left behind. He arrived in America during the greatest wave of Jewish immigration in history. Between 1881 and 1924, more than 2 million Jews, overwhelmingly from the impoverished and persecuted shtetls of the Russian Empire, fled the pogroms and crushing poverty of Eastern Europe for the promise of America. This massive influx created a crisis within the established American Jewish community. The existing German Jewish elite, including our crowd on Wall Street, were often deeply ambivalent, even hostile, towards these newcomers. They were assimilated, reform, German-speaking, and wealthy. The new immigrants were poor, Orthodox, Yiddish-speaking, and culturally alien. There was a palpable fear that these unwashed masses would tarnish the hard-won respectability of the established community and fuel a new wave of American anti-Semitism. Felix Warburg rejected this snobbery completely. He saw these desperate immigrants not as a threat, but as brethren in need, as a sacred responsibility. He threw his boundless energy and his immense fortune into creating an infrastructure to help them not just survive, but thrive. In 1917, he was the driving force behind the creation of the Federation for the Support of Jewish Philanthropic Societies of New York City, a revolutionary concept at the time. Before this, Jewish charity was a chaotic landscape of hundreds of small competing organizations. Felix, the ultimate rational banker, sought to bring order and efficiency to this world, creating a single centralized fundraising and allocation body, a community chest that could raise more money and distribute it more effectively based on community-wide needs. This model became the template for Jewish federations across North America. He poured his resources into institutions like the Henry Street Settlement, which provided everything from nursing care to English classes for new immigrants. He was a major benefactor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the flagship institution of conservative Judaism, ensuring the intellectual and spiritual vibrancy of Jewish life in America. He supported hospitals, orphanages, and educational alliances, building the scaffolding of a community that could lift itself up. He understood that true charity was not about a wealthy man dispensing alms from on high. It was about providing the tools for dignity, self-sufficiency, and cultural continuity. Felix's compassion knew no borders. As the First World War engulfed Europe in 1914, he was horrified by the reports of the catastrophic suffering of the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, who were trapped in the heart of the Bloodlands, the primary battleground between the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires. Millions were caught in the crossfire, their communities devastated, facing starvation and disease on an apocalyptic scale. The war had also severed the lines of communication and support from the Jewish communities of Western Europe. American Jewry was now their only hope. In November 1914, in a meeting at the headquarters of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Felix Warburg was a central figure in one of the most significant moments in the history of modern Jewish life, the founding of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known simply as the JDC, or the Joint. This new organization was an unprecedented effort, a coalition that brought together the often feuding factions of American Jewry, the wealthy German Reform Jews, the more traditional Orthodox groups, and the secular socialists, into a single unified relief effort. It was a lifeline, a powerful expression of collective responsibility that transcended religious and political differences. Felix was named its first chairman and became its driving force. Under his leadership, the JDC raised staggering sums of money and performed logistical miracles, delivering food, medicine, and clothing to the war-torn Jewish communities of Poland, Russia, and Galicia. It was a neutral organization, providing aid to Jews on both sides of the conflict. Its motto simply, "Where there is a Jew in need, the Joint is there." After the war, its work continued, helping to rebuild devastated communities, establish orphanages for the thousands of parentless children, and provide loans to help artisans and small businessmen get back on their feet. The JDC became a model of international humanitarian aid, a powerful new force on the world stage. Through his tireless work with the JDC, Felix Warburg helped save literally hundreds of thousands of lives and laid the groundwork for a global network of Jewish self-help that continues to this day to be a first responder to crises around the world. He wasn't just writing checks, he was building a global rescue organization, forging connections, and providing tangible hope in a world that was descending into darkness. Yet even as the Warburgs were contributing so profoundly to the fabric of American and global society, Paul building the foundations of its financial stability, Felix building its charitable infrastructure. A vile and insidious poison was seeping into the public discourse. It was the ancient scourge of anti-Semitism, but now it was being repackaged for a modern industrial age. It was given a new pseudo-intellectual gloss and amplified by the new technologies of mass media. And the Warburgs, with their German origins, their international connections, and their undeniable prominence in finance, became a prime and recurring target for this new wave of industrialized hate. This new anti-Semitism was fueled by fraudulent texts like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This document, which was concocted by the Tsarist secret police in Russia at the turn of the century, purported to be the secret minutes of a Jewish cabal plotting to achieve world domination through the manipulation of finance, the control of the press, and the fomenting of wars. It was a work of pure fiction, a clumsy and paranoid fantasy, a plagiarism of earlier political pamphlets. But in the anxious, dislocated atmosphere of the post-World War I era, it was treated as an authentic and terrifying revelation by millions of people across the globe. It provided a simple, all-encompassing explanation for a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. And in the United States, its most powerful and influential proponent was a man revered by millions as an industrial folk hero, the very icon of American ingenuity, Henry Ford. Beginning in May of 1920, Henry Ford used his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which he forced upon every Ford dealer in the country, to launch a relentless 91-week-long attack on the Jewish people. The series of articles was later collected and published in a set of 4 volumes under the title, The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. This was not the subtle, coded anti-Semitism of the country club. This was blunt, vicious, eliminationist propaganda. Ford's newspaper, with a circulation that reached nearly 1 million, became the primary conduit for spreading the lies of the protocols to a mass American audience. And at the very center of Henry Ford's paranoid conspiracy theories was Paul Warburg. Ford's paper accused Paul of being a foreign agent, a representative of the Rothschilds, who had masterminded the creation of the Federal Reserve not to stabilize the American economy, but to subordinate it to a shadowy group of international Jewish bankers. The Fed, in Ford's twisted telling, was the linchpin of the global plot, the invisible government that controlled the nation's destiny. Ford and his ghostwriters weaponized every aspect of Paul's biography: his German birth, his family's powerful European bank, his undeniable expertise, his role at the secret Jekyll Island meeting. All were twisted into proof of a sinister conspiracy. He was depicted as the spider at the center of a vast web, manipulating the nation's currency for the benefit of his tribe and the detriment of the common Christian American. The sheer absurdity of these claims was matched only by their malice and their insidious persistence. The Warburgs were accused of financing the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. They were accused of having started World War I to profit from the bloodshed on both sides. They were accused of controlling the world's governments from behind the scenes, all as part of the grand plot outlined in the protocols. These were not just the ravings of a fringe lunatic writing in a basement pamphlet. This was Henry Ford, one of the most famous and respected men in the world, lending his immense prestige and his vast fortune to the propagation of the oldest and most dangerous of libels. Adolf Hitler would later praise Henry Ford in his book Mein Kampf and keep a portrait of the American industrialist in his office. The attacks took a deep and painful personal toll on the family. They were a proud, intensely private family who had embraced America and had dedicated themselves to its betterment. To be publicly branded as traitors, as conspirators, as secret enemies of their adopted country was a deep and painful wound. The controversy highlighted the terrible precariousness of their position. They could be insiders, advisors to presidents, and pillars of the financial establishment. And yet, in the eyes of millions of their fellow citizens, they remained perpetual outsiders, their every action and achievement capable of being twisted through the distorted lens of anti-Semitism. The lies published by Henry Ford in the 1920s, even after he was forced to issue a public apology in 1927, would prove to have a terrifyingly long half-life. They created a durable template of hate, a set of toxic myths that would be recycled by demagogues for generations to come, from the Nazis in the 1930s to the darkest corners of the internet today. The Warburgs were learning a terrible and tragic lesson, that reason, good works, and patriotic service are not always a sufficient defense against the primal, irrational power of an all-consuming hatred. And an even greater, more monstrous storm was now gathering in their ancestral homeland. While the American Warburgs were battling the poison of libels and conspiracy theories, their family in Germany was facing a threat of a different order of magnitude. This was not a war of words. It was the dawn of a systematic state-sponsored war against the Jewish people themselves. The appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, transformed the Warburgs world and the world of all German Jews from one of privilege, patriotism, and prestige into a waking nightmare. Max Warburg, the proud German statesman who had advised the Kaiser and served his country with unwavering devotion at Versailles, suddenly found himself and his family declared enemies of the state, reviled as prime examples of the Judeo-Bolshevik plutocratic conspiracy that was the central obsession of Nazi ideology. The golden age of the German-Jewish symbiosis was over. An age of unprecedented horror was about to begin. The initial years of Nazi rule were a time of creeping terror, of a slow, methodical strangulation of Jewish life that was all the more insidious for its gradualism. This was not yet the Holocaust of the gas chambers, but the social death that preceded it. The first organized nationwide action was the boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st, 1933. Soon after, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed, purging Jews from all government positions, including universities, law courts, and schools. Each new month brought a new decree, a new humiliation. Jews were barred from public parks, from swimming pools, from concert halls. Their world was shrinking, the walls closing in. For Max Warburg and for much of the established, assimilated German Jewish leadership, this period was one of agonizing and ultimately tragic miscalculation. Max was a rationalist, a man who believed in logic, in negotiation, in the fundamental decency of the German people he knew and loved. He, like many others in his circle, simply could not fathom that a nation as cultured and civilized as Germany could truly succumb to the primitive thuggish barbarism of the Nazi Party. He viewed Hitler as an aberration, a vulgar demagogue whose radicalism would surely be tamed by the responsibilities of power or moderated by the conservative establishment. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that this madness was a temporary political fever, a national nervous breakdown from which the country would eventually recover. And so, he made the fateful decision to stay. He felt a profound sense of duty, a captain's obligation not to abandon the ship in a storm. He used his still considerable international prestige and his network of contacts to fight a desperate rearguard action. He met with government officials and the head of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Schacht, arguing not for Jewish rights, which he knew was a lost cause, but on pragmatic economic grounds, warning them that their anti-Semitic policies would destroy Germany's international credit and bring economic ruin. He worked tirelessly within Jewish communal organizations to provide aid to those who had lost their livelihoods, to organize vocational retraining, and to facilitate an orderly immigration for those who wished to leave. His choice to remain was born not of naivete, but of a deep patriotic love for a Germany that was already ceasing to exist, a belief in a German ideal that the Nazis were methodically destroying day by day. Not everyone in the family shared Max's lingering optimism. His distant cousin, Siegmund Warburg, a brilliant and fiercely independent young banker working in the Berlin office of the family firm, saw the writing on the wall with chilling clarity. Siegmund was of a younger generation, less invested in the patriotic pieties of the past. He was a maverick, a rebel who had often clashed with the conservative hierarchical culture of the Hamburg Bank. He had no illusions about the true nature and intent of the Nazi regime. He saw it not as a temporary aberration, but as a permanent existential threat. In 1934, soon after Hitler consolidated his power, Siegmund fled Germany for London. He arrived as a refugee with very little capital, but with the two assets that mattered most: his formidable intellect and the power of the Warburg name. From a small office, he began to build a new firm, initially called the New Trading Company, which would later become the legendary investment bank, S.G. Warburg and Company. His flight was a harbinger of the great scattering that was to come, the beginning of a brain drain that would see Germany's brightest minds in science, art, and finance, many of them Jewish, flee the rising tide of barbarism, finding refuge in Britain and America and immeasurably enriching their new homelands. Siegmund's prescience saved his life and allowed him to build a new legacy from the ashes of the old. After the war, his London-based bank would become one of the most innovative and powerful in the world, pioneering the Eurobond market and inventing the hostile takeover, forever changing the face of global finance. Back in Hamburg, the Nazi noose tightened relentlessly. The regime's policy of Arisierung, or Aryanization, which had begun as a voluntary process of pressuring Jews to sell their businesses, was now becoming a systematic, compulsory program of expropriation and theft. For Max Warburg, this meant facing the ultimate and most personal of humiliations: the forced dismantling of the bank his family had painstakingly built over 140 years. It was a slow, agonizing, and public vivisection. First, he was pressured to dismiss all his Jewish employees, men and women who had served the firm with loyalty for decades. Then, the Nazi authorities demanded that Max and his brother Fritz resign from the board. Finally, they came for the bank itself. The pressure was unbearable. His non-Jewish partners, men who had been his trusted colleagues and friends for years, were brought before the Gestapo and given an ultimatum. Either they take control of the bank, or the state would confiscate it outright, and they would all be ruined. In 1938, facing the inevitable, Max was finally forced to sell M.M. Warburg and Company. The buyers were his longtime partner, Rudolf Brinkmann, and a syndicate of non-Jewish Hamburg interests. The price was a mere fraction of its true value. As a final galling indignity, the bank's name was changed to Brinkmann, Wirtz and Company. The Warburg legacy in Hamburg, a cornerstone of the city's identity for a century and a half, had, it seemed, been officially erased. This was not just a financial transaction, it was a profound act of cultural vandalism. the theft of a family's soul, the deliberate destruction of a legacy built across generations. Yet even in this darkest of hours, Max's primary concern remained for others. He leveraged what little influence he had left, negotiating tirelessly with the Nazi regime to create a special immigration fund. He used his own dwindling personal fortune and his connections to the American branch of the family to pay the punitive Reichsfluchtsteuer, the Reich flight tax, a massive exit fee that the Nazis imposed on Jews to strip them of 90% or more of their remaining assets before they were allowed to flee. It was a heartbreaking, heroic, and ultimately inadequate effort to ransom human lives from a regime of gangsters. Max himself finally left Germany for New York in August of 1938. Just 3 months later, the nationwide state-sponsored pogrom of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, would erupt across Germany, signaling the final, irrevocable descent from persecution into open murderous violence. Max Warburg, the great German patriot, arrived in America a refugee, a stateless and broken man, exiled from the country he had served with a lifetime of unwavering devotion. World War II, the cataclysm that the Nazis had unleashed upon the world, scattered the family to the winds, but could not break their indomitable spirit. In America, they threw themselves into the war effort. Felix had passed away in 1937, just before the worst of the storm broke, but his wife Frida and his children carried on his philanthropic work, raising vast sums for refugee relief. Paul had died in 1932, but his son James Warburg became an influential writer and a prominent advisor to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But perhaps the most dramatic story was that of Max's son, Eric. Eric Warburg had emigrated in 1938 and had immediately become a U.S. citizen. When the war broke out, he enlisted, driven by a fierce desire to fight the regime that had destroyed his home and murdered his people. With his fluent German, his intimate understanding of the German elite, and his brilliant analytical mind, he was a natural for military intelligence. He became a high-ranking officer in the Army Air Forces, a master interrogator who specialized in questioning high-value prisoners of war, including captured Luftwaffe generals and German industrialists. From these interrogations, he gleaned priceless intelligence about German war production, military morale, and the secret weapons programs. He was an American officer fighting for the liberation of his new homeland, and in a twist of almost poetic justice, he was also fighting for the liberation of the country that had betrayed him. He was part of the force that would ultimately free his native Germany from the tyranny that had driven him out. When the war finally ended in 1945, Eric Warburg returned to a Hamburg that was little more than a ghost of its former self. The city had been pulverized by Allied bombing. Its port was a graveyard of twisted metal. Its people were demoralized and starving, and its future was profoundly uncertain. And then, in this landscape of utter devastation, a remarkable and deeply moving thing happened. Rudolf Brinkmann and the other German partners, who had taken over the bank during the Nazi era and who had managed through great skill and cunning to preserve some of its core assets through the war, voluntarily and unconditionally returned the firm to the Warburg family. It was a profound act of restitution and personal integrity, a small but powerful flicker of decency in the moral wasteland left by the Third Reich. In 1945, Eric Warburg, the American intelligence officer, took back control of the family bank. The name was immediately changed back to M.M. Warburg and Company. The task of rebuilding seemed impossible. But Eric, imbued with his family's legendary resilience and a deep, if complicated, love for his native city, dedicated the rest of his life to it. He became a crucial bridge between the new democratic West Germany and the United States. He used his unparalleled connections in both countries to foster trust, encourage American investment through the Marshall Plan, and help shepherd Hamburg through its spectacular post-war recovery, its Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. Against all conceivable odds, the bank not only survived but thrived, once again becoming one of Germany's most respected and successful private banks. The Warburg name, which the Nazis had tried with all their might to erase from history, was once again a symbol of integrity, endurance, and rebirth in the heart of Hamburg. So, after everything, what does the final Warburg balance sheet show? They were architects of the modern world. Paul created the U.S. Federal Reserve, the bedrock of the global financial system. Siegmund's London bank, S.G. Warburg, revolutionized European finance before becoming part of the giant UBS. And miraculously, Max and Eric's bank, M.M. Warburg and Company, stolen by the Nazis, was returned and reborn from the ashes, once again a symbol of integrity in Hamburg. But their story is also a chilling warning about the persistent poisonous power of anti-Semitism. The baseless conspiracy theories used against them by Henry Ford and the Nazis a century ago still echo today in the darkest corners of the internet. They were the ultimate insiders, yet they were forever treated as outsiders, their loyalty questioned, even as they dedicated themselves to building a better society. Ultimately, their deepest legacy isn't found in bank vaults or on stock exchange floors. It lives on in the Warburg Institute in London, where Abe's trove of knowledge continues to enlighten humanity. It lives on in the life-saving work of the JDC, the global humanitarian engine Felix built. And it lives on in the actions of Eric Warburg, who returned to the ruins of his past, not for revenge, but to rebuild. This is the bottom line on the Warburgs' ledger, a legacy measured not in gold, but in the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit.